seminar, which is set up by the Centre for Homeless Impact. My name is Julia Unwin, and I've been asked to chair this event and also to introduce our stellar cast of speakers. I know we're joined by at least 60 people out there. We can't see you, but I hope you can see us and hear what we've got to say. What we're talking about today is the role of levelling up, the role of rural equality and development in resolving long, deep-seated issues of homelessness. We couldn't have a better panel today to talk about this. And I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves. Then I'm going to say a little bit from my long experience of working in both the economic development and the homelessness sector, what I think links us, and then invite our speakers to contribute. We'll then try and have a conversation and take questions and comments from the 60 or so people who are joining us today. So as I say, my name's Julia Unwin. I'm delighted to be here. And let's go to Alex as our first speaker to introduce himself.
Hi there, my name's Alex Clare Young. I'm a part-time minister, but I spend most of my time working on researching, writing, speaking and facilitating training about inclusion and diversity from an LGBTQ+ perspective. Thank you.
And we have two people called Emma. I'm not going to muddle them up. So Emma Reevy first, please.
Hi there, I'm the Chief Executive of the Trussell Trust, and we support a network of 1,300 food bank centres across the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Emma. Emma Roddick.
Hello, yes, I'm the other Emma. I'm a newly elected member of the Scottish Parliament for the Highlands and Islands, so I'll be here bringing a rural Scotland perspective today.
Congratulations on your election. And Paul.
Hello everybody, I'm Paul Morrish. I'm the Chief Executive of Land Aid. We're a grant-making trust, and we derive all of our income from the commercial property industry.
Thank you. I don't think we're going to have a better group of people to discuss this vexed issue of how does the economic and social recovery of this country after the catastrophe of the last 15 months, how does that recovery empower, enable homeless people and ensure that homelessness disappears as the scourge it undoubtedly is. We have over the decades in this country faced a rising number of people who are homeless, insecurely and badly housed. We are coming out of this disastrous episode in our national lives with an opportunity, and it's an opportunity that we squander at our peril, in my view. We have a government that is committed to this rather odd, slightly slippery phrase about levelling up. I'm not sure if that phrase will last test of time, but what will last the test of time is the recognition that we are in a deeply unequal country, that wealth is accumulated and held in some parts of the UK, and other parts of the UK are left without access to that wealth and that opportunity. That for many young people, going to London is the only place you can go if you have any ambition, and the one place nobody can afford to live unless they have a huge amount of private background support. We live in a country where levelling up, if it is to mean greater equality, more opportunity for people in the left behind areas of the country, must mean a clear and rigorous focus on a new economy, an economy in which we can have some prosperity for all. Now, I've worked for very many decades in the homelessness sector in the 80s. Before we even had food banks, I was involved in all of that. And it's quite a thought that we didn't even know about food banks before 2010. And I've also worked on issues of economic and social development. And what struck me preparing for today's session is how frequently we have two entirely separate conversations. We talk about economic recovery as if we could talk about that without thinking about homelessness and people facing huge housing stress and housing injustice. And from my point of view, there is no possible room for economic recovery unless people are decently, properly housed. Nobody has ever taken up a training and skills opportunity when they live in insecure housing and succeeded. Nobody ever starts a new job when they don't know where they're going to be sleeping tomorrow. They're surfing on a sofa or sleeping in somebody's spare room and they know they're going to be kicked out next week. No investor wants to put money into a place where people are still living in tents on the high street, which is still the position in many of the towns and cities across the UK. So the notion that we can have some sort of economic recovery with it isn't absolutely rooted in giving people the home that we all need, the stability, the sense of certainty that we've all used. I've certainly used my home as the place from which I've built my life, and I defy anyone to do that without the security of a home. We've talked for decades in the homelessness sector about the iron triangle of housing. We need housing that is secure, that is of high quality, and it's a reasonable cost. And homeless people today are facing an offer of housing, which is extraordinarily expensive. To rent a home in most parts of the UK still costs more than many people's mortgage payments. It's extraordinarily insecure and increasingly so. The much longed for eviction ban that took place, thank God it took place during the COVID crisis, is about to go, and we know what that will do. It will only ramp up that insecurity. And people are living in extraordinarily poor quality housing. We as taxpayers, through housing benefit, are paying for some of the poorest quality housing that anyone can have to live in. So that hard triangle, the iron triangle of security, cost and quality, is what we need to address. And the Centre for Homelessness Impact is well placed to do it. But if we don't address it, if we don't seriously use this opportunity to rebuild Britain in a way that makes it a possible place for people to work, we will have no economic recovery. And my contention today is that government needs to take these two things equally seriously and recognise that levelling up, maybe it is about putting broadband in the Highlands, maybe it is about building high-speed rail, maybe it isn't, maybe it's about all sorts of things, but it's absolutely at its core got to be about a better housing offer, because all the inward investment strategies in the world will collapse if people don't feel they've got the security, the stability and the resilience to take part in what is going to be a very challenging labour market. If the recovery brings more poorly paid, unreliable, insecure, dangerous and dirty work, if that's what's on offer in an environment in which people cannot claim any security for where they live, we are facing a very dark time indeed. And I'm encouraged by the people who've joined this webinar, but also the people who've been working with CHI all through these last few days, to think of a better approach to homelessness, and one that doesn't treat it as a separate issue on the sidelines, but one that affects every household in the country. Anyone who has children growing up knows that home ownership, theoretically the goal for so many people, is in effect a hereditary tenure. If your parents are not homeowners, your chances of becoming a homeowner are vanishingly small unless you become some amazing hedge fund manager. You are not going to own your own home. And in that environment, we will only perpetuate massive inequality if we don't start to address the huge housing injustice we face. So on that note, I'm going to ask my panel speakers to reflect on what it means for them and where they think this fits in, and then we'll try and have a conversation about it. There are already people in the chat room, and I'm going to try and keep my eye on both the panelists and the chat room, so test me on that. But can we go first to Paul, because the Land Aid Trust has an important role to play in this agenda. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Julia, and good afternoon, everybody. I just want to say a couple of words, sort of setting the scene from our perspective first, before a couple of very specific points and four quite general overarching points in relation to the topic. And Julia, you covered some key points incredibly well. From our perspective, as a charitable funder, we see, as many will do, the prime problem being a lack of sufficient and affordable housing. This is exacerbated for many people by what is often felt to be an unhelpful or rigid approach to welfare policy and by asymmetric economic activity across the country. And that will clearly be one of the topics for our discussion today. But for young people, there are additional problems as well. Clearly, asymmetric economic activity has a very direct impact on young people who are dependent themselves on, to a large extent, the gig economy. But the private rented sector is wholly inaccessible to most young people on low incomes. And of course, we also have a problem that the care system appears to fail so many of the young people who go through that particular route. And when we think about the hidden homelessness community, it's just helpful to try and think about some numbers. From a youth perspective, it's one of the larger communities of people who are homeless. In a 2015 review of supported housing, it found that about 13% of the 260,000 units of supported housing were for young people. That's about 40,000 thereabouts. Yet last year we have data for 120,000 young people presented to local authorities, according to Centrepoint, asking for housing or homelessness advice, and we're clearly at risk of homelessness. There's a huge mismatch between demand and supply, and that's around supported housing itself. So the two very sort of specific points I just wanted to make is, irrespective of where we're talking in the country, there is a real problem about housing supply, and there has to be a concerted programme to tackle that. We have somewhere in the region of 120,000 empty properties in England alone. So those are properties that have been empty for 6 months or longer, and that number of empty properties is going up. That's an opportunity that we should grab. We are seeing more and more opportunities to develop modular accommodation and to use modern methods of construction. We should certainly use those. Housing should be a basic right, and nothing should take our eye off that particular target. But the second thing is really just to echo Julia's point. It isn't just about numbers. It is about making sure that the accommodation that we provide for us all is of the highest quality and is sustainable as well. What we don't want to do is to put people in accommodation that they can't afford to heat. So sustainability will be important. There are four then overarching points I just wanted to make in my short slot. The first is, and this isn't because I'm necessarily an inveterate optimist, although I am, is that there are causes for hope. We can clearly, as a society, achieve the most extraordinary things. I had my second vaccine on Thursday. Who knew 2 years ago that we would be in the middle of a global pandemic, and that so many extraordinary achievements have been made on the shoulders of so many extraordinary people, institutions, and so on. It has been extraordinary. Clearly, when we focus on whatever the problem may be, we can overcome many of the problems we have. There are a large number of problems to tackle, but there are some real opportunities here. And this point about focus is something I want to come back to with my fourth point. So the first is, I think there are causes for hope. We can achieve extraordinary things. The second is a comment on the term levelling up. Levelling up has a connotation, to my mind, of a wonky table. One of the legs is a little bit short and you just need to stick something up. There's something wrong with one of the legs and you just need to prop it up, and then you'll get some balance. But I think there's more of an issue about turning that around, not levelling up, but levelling out. Because I can't see how we're going to achieve what levelling up is intended to achieve if we don't recognise that there needs to be some give as well as some take. We need to recognise that the wealth of many of us is contingent on the poverty, the disadvantage of many others. And we need to have a very grown-up conversation as a society about what a better balanced, wealthy society really looks like. The third point I'd like to make is about the need for KPIs for government. For many of you on the call, I'm sure you are familiar with having key performance indicators, metrics that you have to deliver either as charities or as businesses or as local government. But where are the KPIs for government? Where are the measures of a successful society that we wish our government to work for? Should those metrics not be a decrease in the wealth gap, improved social mobility, an end to generational poverty, inclusion, and having a home? You know, there is an evidence base that can support good policy decisions, but policy decisions need to be linked to very specific targets that we all need to own. And I think KPIs for government would be a great idea. But I've talked about government. I'm also interested in business. All the money that we raise comes from companies working in commercial real estate. I think business has an extraordinary role to play in levelling up or levelling out, and I think is very interested in doing so. But generally speaking, business doesn't necessarily know how to. And so it sees its ESG agenda very much as handouts to charities. What I think there is a challenge to do, is we're trying to do with the property industry, is to find ways in which we can provide a single focus for companies working within an industry sector to achieve social change. I think there is an opportunity now for government and for society to talk to business and say, it's not enough to have a bake sale. It's not enough just to support the local library. It's important that we focus on real problems and achieve social change. So I hope those are useful as prompting conversations, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you. I'm going to appropriate the brilliant image for Evie next, please. Tell us from your perspective what this looks like from the Trussell Trust.
Thanks, Julia. I think I'd just like to share briefly a little bit of what our research tells us about the impact, particularly of housing problems and homelessness on food bank use, and some of the insights we've gained. At Trussell Trust, our vision is to end the need for food banks in the UK, and we know that to achieve that, it will have to involve tackling homelessness. Last year, around 1 in 5 people referred to a food bank in our network were homeless, and that is living in temporary or emergency accommodation, staying with friends and family, or sleeping rough, which means that people experiencing homelessness are very overrepresented compared to the general working age population. But as has been touched on, we also know that renters, particularly social renters, are significantly overrepresented at food banks. Excuse me, social renters make up 47% of people referred to food banks, compared to 21% of the general population. And in early 2020, our data showed us that just 20% of private renters at food banks said their housing costs were fully supported. 20% had to top up from other benefits, and 52% received no support at all, despite needing to come to a food bank. Whilst for us, our data shows us that the strongest immediate driver of needing a food bank is destitution. That is to say, extremely low income. We know the average household income for somebody coming to a food bank is just £50 a week after rent. There are background drivers compounding the problem, including adverse life experiences in the 12 months before needing a food bank. And amongst those driving life experiences, homelessness is the most common adverse life experience recorded, with 3 in 10 people saying they were homeless in the 12 months before needing a food bank. When problems in our society are hidden, I feel we miss the opportunity to genuinely create effective systems for change. And we've seen that a lack of awareness about what drives food bank need has led to a belief that food bank need is a problem that's located over there or elsewhere, rather than something affecting people in all of our communities. Our food bank network itself actually began in Salisbury. That's where our first food bank was. So not your stereotypical location for a food bank, either then or now. And our origins are rooted in the problem of out of sight need. And we know from our network that the geography of need for food banks largely follows the geography of destitution. So more likely to be in former industrial areas in the North and Midlands, some coastal towns and some London boroughs, but not exclusively. And food banks are located in areas from Cornish towns to rural Norfolk to the Highlands and Islands. And as I've said, we know that the immediate need for food banks is driven by very low income, particularly from benefits. So social security system must play a large part in any long-term solution. But we also know wider factors play an indirect role, which can be equally a problem, or potentially even more so, in rural areas and small towns. For example, we know people referred to food banks are disproportionately affected by insecurity and precarity in the jobs market. Around a third of non-working households at food banks had somebody in work in the past year. And one of the other key, albeit indirect, drivers of food bank use is a lack of or exhausted local support networks, including formal local services like local welfare assistance or local advice services, and informal support from friends and family. And access to these services, both formal and informal, is much more challenging in rural areas and small towns, and this compounds the problem. So investment in policy solutions like the levelling up agenda cannot solely be driven by postcode. We must understand the underlying drivers of need to design solutions which work regardless of where that need arises. And any serious levelling up agenda has to involve cross-party consensus and involve all levels of government to tackle destitution, which drives both the need for food banks and homelessness. A big part of that will be about our social security system, ensuring that we all have enough money to pay for the essentials such as food and housing. But we know other solutions will also be important too. For example, tackling the housing affordability crisis to ensure the essentials are affordable and accessible to all of us. So for us, there's such a clear link between the issues that are driving people into being homeless and also driving people into food banks. We need a joined up concerted plan around tackling destitution rather than just focusing on aspects of the problem, but more of a joined up concerted plan across the board.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you very much. Could I go straight to Emma Roddick, because you talked about cross-party, and we've actually got somebody from a political party here, but from a very different perspective, from a rural area. So Emma, could we go to you next, and then I'll come to you next.
Absolutely, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's already been really interesting to hear what everyone else has had to say. Just to give a bit of background, before my election, I was housing spokesperson for my group on the Highland Council, which meant a lot to me. I've faced a great deal of housing issues myself, including unfair rent increases, a landlord who didn't care that I didn't have hot water for nearly a year, and being homeless. One thing that struck me both in my time on the council and when trying to access services while homeless was that even well-intentioned, caring people can be incredibly unhelpful because they just don't understand. My housing officer was a truly lovely woman, met with me and my local councillor at the time to discuss my application, and one of the first questions she asked me was, "What is your address?" Now, that wasn't her fault. The council system needs an address to process a homelessness application. I've also faced problems in trying to get people who have come to me for help because they've got a looming threat of eviction or are living with abuse, because they struggle to get the same assistance that they would if they actually had that eviction notice that they know is coming, or if they were living on a friend's futon instead of their parents' sofa. Now, their situation is not necessarily better. In fact, it can be worse, but I find that even those working with homeless people daily still have a very specific idea of what homelessness looks like and how a homeless person acts and looks. And to tackle that, we need to make sure that we're providing evidence and data to policymakers to support calls from homeless people and organisations, and make sure that we're making the arguments properly in a way that people who haven't experienced these situations themselves can still understand. Proper data collection is absolutely vital for evidence-led change. Now, what I'm talking about is UK-wide, but one issue that I've come across again and again is that the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation isn't useful in identifying deprivation in rural areas. Because of the sparse population, one data zone could have someone living in extreme fuel poverty, struggling with rurality, and then a few miles down the road, they have their rich, comfortable neighbours, and the SIMD indicates that their area is doing really well. So hidden homelessness in rural areas is not going to be uncovered while we still have poor collection of data. Another consideration, particularly for areas in the Highlands like Wester Ross and Skye, which have high levels of tourism, is that many residential properties, over 50% of the stock in some places, are being used as short-term lets and holiday homes. You could argue that that's good for the local economy. It's certainly good for the absentee landlords who are buying up a dozen properties and getting more income in a month over the summer than they would in a private let over a year, but it is not good for the homeless people in these areas. These areas with the high number of holiday lets are the same ones as those with the highest homeless at home presentations, and that's not a coincidence. But one thing unaccounted for even in those high figures is that many young people can't find a way to move out of their parents' house and still live locally. They're not homeless at home, they're just at home, but that is one of the things that is driving people out of rural areas. And we need to start discussing that. It often involves being stuck in an abusive household, or having to hide your sexuality or other characteristics at home as a form of being homeless at home. If nothing else, it would help us understand fully the scale of this problem, because it is one of the main drivers of depopulation. I know I've not really touched on the UK government's levelling up concept, because honestly, I don't like the term. Yeah. It sounds to me a bit like we're calling life a game. If you play enough, you collect enough points, then you'll level up. But we're not all starting at the same level, and some folk have the cash to buy loot boxes. You can't treat rural areas like they're urban, and you can't treat deprived areas like they just haven't tried hard enough. The problem isn't that rural areas are at a lower level than everyone else, it's that we face different challenges, and strategies and surveys have not managed to understand those challenges, or they have chosen to ignore them altogether. So we need to look at the barriers which exist and break them down, look at what is causing poverty and try to tackle it with long-term attention, because it will never be a case of level up and job done. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm really looking forward to taking your questions later on.
Thank you, Emma. I think we all feel very uneasy with this rather sort of gimmicky term levelling up, but I think we know what we mean. We mean intervention by governments across the UK and local authorities to improve life prospects. And that has to be done locally, but I'm with Emma Reevy that if we only do it locally, we miss the point. Equally, if we don't focus on the local, we may miss what's really going to drive lasting change. Final speaker on this panel is Alex Clare Young. I'm really glad you're with us, Alex. Can you take about 5 minutes as well? And then we've all got questions. I've got some questions for you anyway.
It's good to be here with you today. Thank you. My work kind of draws very closely on my own lived experience. I'm a transmasculine non-binary person, which means that I transitioned towards male around a decade ago, and homelessness is a big part of my lived experience as a member of the LGBT community. For me and many LGBTQ+ young people today, homelessness in rural, isolated and post-industrial contexts is often not related just to housing and finance, although of course they matter, but also to a lack of social support and a lack of opportunities for personal development. And my experience and the experience of many who I work with has been that this has only worsened during the pandemic. To introduce my lived experience, I need to rewind about 15 years or so ago to before my transition. As a teenager, I lived in a small post-industrial town in Midlothian in Scotland. I commuted for over an hour on public transport to go to school, and I had no social life at all. I was very, very unhappy, and I was starting to explore my gender and sexuality in an area where there were no services at all for LGBT young people. In the midst of a rapidly escalating fight with my parents over the male clothing that I had secretly begun to buy, I was made homeless. Some people describe this as voluntary homelessness, try to insist that I could have gone back. But for me and for many LGBT young people, there's nothing voluntary about it. I couldn't go back, and my mental and physical health were at really serious risk. My time as a homeless young person was in some ways better than most, but it was far from ideal or easy. After a few nights staying on an adult friend's sofa, other adults in my life threatened to report her to the police, and she chucked me out. I've never heard from her since. As a homeless person who was classed as vulnerable due to my age, I was told that I was entitled to emergency accommodation. For the first 2 nights, this meant a shelter, which was very limited and very, very unsafe as an LGBT person, and I was then placed in a sheltered house for vulnerable girls. This was better than the shelter, but still not ideal for a trans person who was beginning to explore a male identity. I was bullied mercilessly by the girls, and I was repeatedly assaulted by the boyfriend of my roommate. Eventually, I was offered a facilitated conversation with my mum, which led to the drawing up of a behaviour agreement and my return to the family home, and eventually was able to go to university. So I know that in this I'm very privileged, but on the other hand, my experiences as a homeless young person have had lasting effects. I suffer from complex post-traumatic stress, and I have in the past put myself in risky situations in order to ensure that I have somewhere to live. I've struggled with financial management throughout my life, and I often undervalue my own abilities, frequently working for free. I worry what other people think about me, and I still don't own a house or have job security. And I know that, like for many people my age, these struggles are likely to continue for me for some time, possibly forever. Now that I do some work as an inclusion and diversity specialist, I understand a lot more about the factors underlying my homelessness. And in particular, I'm a passionate advocate for LGBTQ+ young people, and I find the high rate of homelessness amongst people like me appalling. I wonder if those listening knew that a quarter of transgender and non-binary young people have experienced homelessness. Not in the past year, in their lives, a quarter of transgender and non-binary young people have experienced homelessness. What's more, LGBTQ+ homelessness is often categorized as voluntary, and many homelessness services, like the one that I lived in, are incredibly unsafe for LGBTQ+ people. Very few homelessness service providers or social housing providers undertake LGBTQ+ inclusion and diversity training, and many services are divided by gender and as such don't have spaces for trans people like me. Rather than space being made for us, we're often effectively told to suck it up and go home to dangerous situations. In post-industrial and rural contexts, the resources to support LGBTQ+ people are often sadly missing, and I believe that this has got to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for a very, very important and what's the word? Shocking report, but one that doesn't surprise, I suspect, anyone on the panel or anyone listening. But to hear those figures in that way takes us really to the heart of what all of this is about, which is, yes, homelessness is across the country. It's across all 4 nations of the UK. It's experienced in cities and towns and in rural areas, but it's experienced very differently. And that experience means that we can sometimes hide from ourselves what's really going on, which is that acute housing shortage is letting all of these dreadful experiences that both you and Emma Reevey and Emma Ruddick described of people's personal pain and hurt just be ignored. And I completely agree with you. Terms like voluntary homelessness are an abuse of the term, I think, because I don't think anyone volunteers to be homeless. I think people end up in a position where they have very little choice about what they do. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask panel members a bit, if we could just go on to this issue of the local, because this is a national scandal. This is a really major national issue, but it's often perceived and dealt with and experienced locally, and the differences are real. You have a very different experience in different places. I'm also very conscious that from other work I've done, everybody in this country feels an incredibly strong sense about place and the place they come from. I remember working in homelessness in the 80s in London, and people would be passionate Glaswegians or from Dublin or Manchester or wherever they come from. Are our systems, by being so place blind, not respecting people's commitment and interest in the place, forcing people to move when, like Alex, they need to go somewhere safer, or some of the people Emma's talking about are just desperate and destitute? I wonder if place is an important thing for us to think about more in the homelessness context. Does that ring any bells for anyone on the panel? Does it make any sense? Paul, yes.
Thank you, Julia. It's interesting. But I spend a fair amount of my job, my time, trying to persuade many of the 200 odd businesses that support us that they should have a broader approach to tackling homelessness than simply trying to do so on their doorstep. Often businesses want to see some sense in which they are contributing to a problem that they and their staff experience on a daily basis. So in a strange and potentially rather perverse way, we find ourselves sometimes in a slightly paradoxical situation. But there are also some very interesting moves, both in the area of charity policy around place-based giving, where charitable funders are being brought together to understand the problem in a particular community and to understand the very particular local hurdles that might need to be overcome to resolve that problem. That is a fascinating approach. It is often an evidence-informed approach and is one that requires a long-term commitment to iterative discussion about what's working and what's not. But as is often the case, and this will be a bang I drum from time to time, I bang from time to time. We miss the opportunity to understand that there are powerful allies that we could draw upon. In the same way as charitable foundations are looking at place-based giving and place-based investment, so too there are investors and there are businesses that see their purpose as defining and making a place in which people live and work and learn and love for a generation to come. And we are very attracted to some of those businesses and those philosophical conversations about how, when you're investing in real estate, you can at the same time invest in a community. It comes very much to, I suppose, a model of mindful collaboration. And generally, business tends to work with stakeholders in a rather polarized and perhaps atomized way, and with local authorities. Local authorities work with business on often an antagonistic basis, and with charities. Charities work with businesses in an often child-adult relationship. But actually, the real potential here is for business and government and charities, not-for-profits, to work together in common purpose. And I think that place-based focus is a very powerful driver if you have those three parties working in the same space at the same time.
And I would add the voice of homeless people too. But I'd go back to the point I made. Nobody wants to invest in a place where the people cannot do the jobs you want to create because they are insecurely housed, or in a place which is just too difficult to work in. And I think a number of the businesses you were talking about, Paul, are getting more and more sure of that. There's a question in the chat for Alex. Alex, you described very powerfully your own experience and that of so many people in your community. What's the solution? Is the question I've got.
So I think there are three levels. The first one being more inclusion and diversity work at just every level to make sure that there are spaces and services for everyone, and that it's not one protected characteristic over and against another. It's really about everyone. More understanding and kind of nuanced responses to youth homelessness, including early support for parents and proper conflict resolution. And finally, just treating people as people rather than problems, because for trans young people, we often kind of get buried in debates. And actually, perhaps time and money would be better spent kind of ensuring our safety and wellness.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. It's wonderful to hear you say that, particularly this week. It's a really important message that we should all hear. There's a question for Emma Roddick, which you talked about the problems of collecting data, which has always been a well-known thing in very spread out areas, is that it can suddenly look very peculiar when you just aggregate it. The question is from Richard, what's holding us back from getting the data right in rural Scotland? There have been plans to do things, but we seem to stumble on this. Certainly all my life, it's been an issue.
Yeah, well, I think I spoke about a few different types of data, but in terms of the issues I raised with the SIMD, we do have another way of collecting data, the socioeconomic performance set. The problem at the moment is getting people to use it alongside SIMD. And in terms of collecting data on people who are not falling under the definition of homeless at home, but certainly could fall under a definition of homeless at home, is that they may not see themselves that way, or they may have difficulties in reaching out to a local authority. So it would be quite hard to fully get everybody's information and who they are, where they are, what situation they're in. But part of that is going to be normalizing it. And if we start talking about this as an issue, if we start talking about if you're unable to move out of your parents' house because you simply can't afford to have a place to live in your local area, then this is a housing issue. Then we might get more people coming forward looking for help with that.
Thank you. I wanted to come to Emma Reevey about the Trussell Trust, because I mean, I think it's amazing that you have an ambition to make sure that food banks are not needed. And I said rather flippantly in my introduction that we didn't have food banks before 2010, but we didn't. And I remember going to visit the first one I ever went to see and being shocked, even though I'd run night shelters and soup runs, but food banks were new. I sense that the public discussion, particularly perhaps in local areas, which is what this conversation is about, tends to see food bank use as if it's completely separate from everything else that's going on in the economy. And I just wondered what steps you were able to take, or have I got that right? Is it just seen as a sort of embarrassing extra, instead of us recognising that getting rid of the need for food banks is a KPI, to use Paul's term, about a local authority doing a good job?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've encountered so often a celebration of food bank as a response to a problem. So there's a shortage of food, and we've managed to get that food together and provide it to people, which is just boils down to a fundamental misunderstanding and of what the problem is. Hunger is one symptom of the problem of destitution. And what we know is, even though the work of volunteers in food banks and the generosity of local people donating food to support their neighbours is incredible, it is a deeply undignified thing to have to come to a food bank and rely on the mass distribution of food aid to get by. And it is insufficient. If somebody is unable to afford food, they will be struggling to afford accommodation, personal hygiene items, utilities, essential clothing, new kids' new school shoes. It's a sticking plaster at best. And I think the conversation needs to come back to, and when we mobilise people locally, when we were talking just a moment ago about that place-based response, I think there is hope in the response of food banks, in that what we see is local people, local businesses, local churches and other faith groups coming together, having identified a problem and responding. It's about reframing, together with local authorities, the nature of that problem. And talking about how do we make our local authority, our local area, the first area that ends the need for food banks, that actually tackles destitution in all its forms and puts in place appropriate local welfare assistance, appropriate services that are accessible and affordable, that tackles issues around the affordability of housing, and really systematically breaks down that need for emergency food, which is really just a barometer of a much wider and pernicious issue in terms of people facing all aspects of destitution, including homelessness.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because over the last few years, there's been an explosion of people talking about both homelessness and poverty as if they are lots of different aspects. You hear about period poverty or street homelessness or hidden homelessness. Actually, if you haven't got enough money to feed yourself, you are going to be in a full poverty. And similarly, if you can't meet your housing costs, which in this country are one of the biggest reasons people fall into poverty, where they're tripped into poverty, is because of the rent they have to pay. It's not a separate issue. I wondered on that front, Alex, I mean, the question in the chat here is, what do you think about facilitator conversations? Is it something we should be thinking about with LGBTQ and youth homelessness? Or is it just another way of separating people off? And I just wondered if you could reflect on that.
I think it's a cautious if it's done well. I think if you're having a facilitated conversation between parents and young people, for example, you need two facilitators. You can't expect that one facilitator can fairly represent the views of both a parent and a young person. Those facilitators need to have proper diversity training, and they need to be able to really deal with really nuanced issues. For me, there was a very clear sense that there was an aim to get me home as quickly as possible, which meant that effectively a contract was drawn up between myself and my parents with no follow-up support at all, which I believe was quite problematic for my own health and for my family. So I think it needs to be done really, really well if it's going to be done at all. Having said that, I think it can work if there is proper facilitation.
Thank you. I mean, that leads on to a question that is also in the chat about stereotypes about homelessness. And, you know, reflecting on this conversation we've had, we have so many different images of homelessness. But actually, the reason I talk about housing need is because it allows, that's the issue. It's not the people. People have all sorts of different reasons why, for some time or other, they are in housing need. And Paul, you work a lot with businesses, and people are moving to different areas of the country because of work. We have very few systems to enable people to make those sorts of transitions. Just as we have no way of dealing in this country with when business changes, when business needs change, they just go and walk away and leave people. I just wonder if you could reflect on those stereotypes.
It's really interesting, and I talked earlier on about the fact that often business doesn't know how to respond. There's also a sense in which business and many people, frankly, it can be about us all, lack the language to reflect or even engage with people who feel different from us or whose life experiences are different from us. Crisis did a very interesting piece of work a little while ago about called the framework, which is looking very much at how we try and encourage a much more courteous, honest conversation about people who are homeless and avoid that sense of othering people and saying, you are a community out there that we will do something to. And Julia, you picked up the point earlier on about including the voices of people who are homeless in that. It is true. We need to work very carefully on the language. We need to stand back and listen to people who have very direct experiences of homelessness. But we also need to engage with people who have very different experiences and to challenge those perceptions and to challenge our own. And it is about conversation. I've been particularly struck in talking to many of the business people that I do, that on the one hand, I see very genuine compassion about the issues that we're discussing, very little sense of what it really feels like, of what those young people's experiences are like. Yet, as businesses, they are passionate about inclusion and diversity. They're passionate about providing opportunities for people from disadvantaged backgrounds to come in their businesses, yet they lack the words to describe that. And I've been so struck that unless you have the words to describe or to even ask the questions that you want, you're going to be quite trapped. And if you feel trapped, you won't want to stay in that discussion space for very long.
There's always a danger, isn't there? And you must come across this, Emma Roddick, sorry to have to use your surname, as a politician, because it's how we talk about these things determines how we're heard. This conversation is really about the economy and how do we respond to housing need in an economy that is in a pretty parlous state at the moment. And yet we know there is going to be a lot of national, local and business intervention to try and revive the economy. We hear prospects from the Bank of England about it's all going to be a great boom. And I fear that boom because I think that it's possible to have a jobless recovery. I think it's possible to have a recovery that doesn't notice the real need and destitution in our midst. And I just wonder, Emma, if you've got thoughts about how you talk about this when you are talking to constituents or talking to other organisations, because you must be doing that all the time.
No, you're absolutely right to raise this. Last week, my local paper ran with a story from a local business person celebrating the fact that despite the pandemic, house prices in the Highlands were skyrocketing. And I thought there's a whole other side to that. We've got people who are facing homelessness and you're celebrating that thanks to outside money, homes are going to be even more expensive. And I think that what we need is representation. And, you know, I've absolutely loved listening to Alex today because so often I am the only person talking about the impact on young people or LGBTQ people, and they've come along and done exactly the same thing. And this is what's really important, is hearing from people with lived experience and hearing from people who, you know, aren't maybe the typical type of person that you would expect to be standing up and talking about housing policy. I don't think I look like what you'd expect somebody to be talking about housing policy to look like, but that's what's really important, I think, in terms of learning and how being able to design policy which actually works for people like us.
I think the thing that the crisis report did, and you've reflected on that, Emma, as well, is it said, let's not talk about homelessness as happening to them. Homelessness is affecting where we live. It's affecting our families and our households. It will affect them in different ways depending on what strength we have and what abilities we have. I mean, strength in terms of the luck that we've had as individuals. But it's not something that happens to them. Housing stress is a huge issue for people who go to university or for people who are starting their first job in an expensive city. It is a really major issue which we've got to make mainstream because it is actually a drag on our recovery. That boom of house prices that you described, every time I see a headline like that, I want to scream and say, why is it a good thing? What that does, those headlines do, is drive people further and further away from what can be done. Now, there's a question in the chat which is sort of relevant to this, which is about, let's not let government off the hook. This is a devolved matter. It happened, it's Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland governments all have housing powers, but so too do local authorities. And I suppose before we come to an end, I'd quite like to get some sense from the panel about the balance between national demands on the national governments, the four nations of the UK, and what can be done locally and regionally. Of course, they have to work together, but we've been saying that for decades. Let's think through in terms of homelessness. Where are the real drivers? Which are the places that are doing this well and are coming up with coherent plans that they can then get government funding for? Or do we have to wait for government to take some of these decisions for us? Who'd like to start before I choose one of you? Emma Reevy, you look like somebody have a view on this.
Well, from a housing stock perspective, less to offer to the conversation, but I think when it talks about affordability and people having enough money, I think we can talk about social security. So I can come from that perspective. Please do. We're really clear, and I think somebody actually put it in one of the chats, that we need to make sure we're not letting UK government off the hook. We talk about there's so much that can be done through local welfare assistance and at a local authority and at a devolved nation level, but fundamentally the main reason people are experiencing destitution, as we see in food banks, is because their income through benefits is insufficient to cover the costs for essentials. And I said at the beginning about some of those statistics around how people are having to use payment from other benefits to top up and cover their housing costs, which is leaving them in a situation where they don't have enough money to afford food, and so are having to come to a food bank. So there's something very badly going wrong with the state of social security. And I think tying in it well slightly to what was just said a moment ago about that othering, I think the pandemic caused all of us to reflect on our security and to think about, if we become unwell or we lose our jobs, what do we expect of our social security system? And the furlough scheme in some way manifests our expectations of our social security scheme. But there is a world of difference between the value of the furlough scheme and how it protected people and stopped them falling into destitution, and what our social security system does. We saw only 4% of people at food banks were on the furlough scheme. That is not 87% of people who are at food banks are receiving social security. So there's a real issue there with the sufficiency of social security, which is something that has to be addressed at UK government level.
Yes, and that is, of course, the reserved matter, isn't it? The interplay between that and housing is a really important one. You've made that point really strongly, and I really support it. Any other views about this national and local issue? Yes, Paul.
Thank you. We work with a lot of local authority areas, or charities working in local authority areas, so we have some insight into where things are going well. And two particular examples, well, I can't go into too much detail. For example, Birmingham City Council and some of the West Midlands areas work incredibly well, particularly around homelessness and youth homelessness, with a really integrated approach that does bring business together and does bring local people together and does bring local government together, and takes a really inclusive approach to the sort of resources that are available. But we were talking to another local authority just this morning. We've been very interested in creating a social investment fund, or supporting the creation of a social investment fund to bring finance to accommodation for young people. And a conversation with a local authority that was really interested in using all of the levers at its disposal to introduce funding that might lease accommodation for up to 40 years at incredibly affordable rates, where the rents can be, perhaps as much as half of LHA level, which gives the local authority an extremely rare strategic opportunity to both do good and to generate income as well. So, in a nutshell, it is clearly variable, but local authorities do have extraordinary opportunities and potential to achieve considerable results. It can be made easier by government policy, but notwithstanding the struggle there, local authorities can be very creative, and some of them are extraordinary.
I'd strongly agree with that. And I always say to people I'm working with, let's not wait and ask for permission, ask for forgiveness in the end. But let's not ask government for permission. Let's do as much as we can. Now, we've got 7 minutes left, which is always the test for a chair, because I've got to get you all to say something and I've got to finish on time, otherwise I should be in trouble. I think a lot of this conversation has sort of circled around the issue about public concern about homelessness. I think it's reached a very high level during the pandemic. I think there is an anxiety. I think what Emma Reevy said is right. We've all realised just how precarious we are, or given thanks for the security that we have and been grateful for it. This is a high moment of opportunity. If that level of public concern is right, we mustn't squander it. Is this an opportunity to do something really radical, because we recognise that people are noticing the issue, are for the first time, perhaps for a long time, aware of our vulnerability? In 1945, after the Second World War, we did extraordinary things. Are we at another moment like that? And is homelessness perhaps an issue that can galvanise people? Who'd like to have a go at that? And we have very few minutes. Alex and Emma, good. I was hoping you'd go for it. Alex first and then Emma.
I guess for me, this question partly comes back to diversity again, because yes, I think you're right that we are at a point where this is something that people are concerned about and people are talking about, but diversity isn't just about othering, it's also about understanding the root causes and being able to come up with a joined up thinking plan to deal with this. So for example, we were just thinking about what the government could do about the benefits system And that immediately makes me think about injustice for people with hidden disabilities, the way in which equalities legislation is problematized, and all of this impacts homelessness. So if we don't understand some of those root causes, which are about the ways in which we're all the same and we're all human, and at the same time we're all unique and have different identities and problems, all of that needs to kind of be worked on together to have a good response, rather than public concern kind of just turning into, oh, well, we'll give money to people to have houses. It's not as simple as that. The complexity needs to be recognized. And at the moment, I'm not sure that that's happening, certainly on a government level.
Thank you. Emma Roddick.
Yeah, short answer is yes, and I'm actually really excited about what we can get done in this session of the Scottish Parliament. The SNP government has appointed a Cabinet Secretary for Housing, which was previously a junior ministerial role, and we have a lot of people in the chamber who have personal experience of homelessness or professional experience of working with people who are homeless. I've already written to said Cabinet Secretary saying, look, we recognise during the pandemic that people were falling into hard times and it wasn't their fault, but that was true before COVID struck, and it will be true after the recovery. So what can we do to extend these protections, even if they're slightly different to what we have at the moment, to make sure that people are always protected regardless of whether or not there's a pandemic on?
Thank you. I have to declare an interest because I spent the summer on the First Minister's Economic Recovery Task Force, led by Benny Higgins, and it was very interesting with all the economists. Housing kept coming up. I mean, I didn't let it go, you can imagine, but actually I got cut through. People recognise that high levels of overcrowding and insecure housing is bad for economic recovery. I was really struck by that. Final words on this issue of the stereotype, not just the stereotype, but the public opinion and public debate. Emma.
I think we've all changed our ways of living, our ways of working in incredible ways over the last 18 months. And the motivation for that was to protect one another. I think that gives me tremendous hope, but we must build on that appetite that we have as a country, as a society, to protect one another and really inform that discussion about the things that can change, not this belief that these things can't change, but really concrete solutions where we can show we can change this, and there is not a need for people to be experiencing homelessness. There's not a need for people to be coming to food banks. We need to build on that will that we've shown one another as a general public to bring about that level of change, and I'm hopeful we can.
Paul, some last words from you on this.
It's just been fascinating listening to my co-panelists, and had I a hat, I would take it off to them all. Emma Reevy, I agree absolutely with your point, and I hope that one of the things that comes from our experience over the last couple of years, and I don't just mean the pandemic, but I mean Brexit as well, is that we take the opportunity, whether we chose it or not, to be part of a collective conversation about the society we want to have. A society that is inclusive, that does try to narrow the gap between the richest and the poorest, does give opportunity to as many people as possible. That conversation will be very, very hard indeed. We do not agree as a society, and we never will. But ensuring that we have some common principles to inform the decisions that we make as a society would be really helpful.
Thank you. I just want to close by saying that working with people like you gives me huge hope that we can make all these changes, but that working as I do in the governments across the UK, I know that the economic recovery is absolutely top and centre of every politician's mind. They are really frightened about where this goes and whether we're heading for a dreadfully scary boom or a deep depression is preoccupying people. I think in the homelessness world, and I'm going to end on something controversial, we spent so long talking about homelessness as need, and of course it is, but actually solving homelessness is opportunity, because the only way we will get people to want to invest in our towns and cities, to want to employ people, is knowing that we have people who have skills and ability. We are wasting a generation of young people at the moment whose level of personal insecurity is so great that they can't take up any of these wonderful offers that might be around. They can't make a contribution. And I think we need to start talking more about what those of us who care about homelessness, run homelessness services, are homeless ourselves, represent homeless people, what we can do to make the economic recovery both a just one, which of course it needs to be, but a real and lasting one. And I do think that the levels of homelessness that we're facing in this country are a drag on our economy, are holding us back, as well as being, to my mind, a moral outrage. They're also an economic real disadvantage. And I think we need to start talking like that. Now, somebody just put in the panel, Senior Gosman's put, rough sleeping is on the agenda, but hidden homelessness less so. Let's make sure that what we used to call hidden homelessness isn't hidden anymore. Let's talk about it really openly, that if you are moving every 10 days and sleeping somewhere else, you are homeless. If you are staying in an abusive relationship because there's nowhere for you to go to, you are homeless. Let's start claiming this narrative, because actually it matters for the well-being of our fellow citizens. It also matters for the recovery of the country. So thank you to CHI for bringing us all together. I think that was a really interesting debate. I think we could have gone on much longer, but I'm not allowed to do that. So can I thank you in turn, Alex, Emma, Paul and Emma. That was a really good discussion and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And the hour went past much more quickly than I'd feared. Hope to see you